Thank you. Please sit down. Thank you, Mr. McCann. We understand you will probably have had a busy morning, so we're grateful to you for making yourself available. Now, Ms. Thornton.
Yes, I appear for Mr. McCann.
Thank you. Mr. McCann, do you wish to affirm or take an oath?
I'll affirm, please.
If you just repeat the words after me. I, Stephen Barry McCann.
I, Stephen Barry McCann.
Sincerely declare and affirm.
sincerely declare and affirm
that the evidence I give to this Commission
that the evidence I give to this Commission
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. McCann. Yes, Ms. Thornton.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr McCann, you've prepared a witness statement dated 25 October 2021 in response to the summons you received from the Commission dated 8 October 2021. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you have a copy of that statement with you?
Yes.
And that's document ID number CRW.998.002.1047?
Yes.
And that's your signature on page 10 of the document?
Yes, it is.
And are the contents of your statement true and correct?
Yes.
Commissioners, I tender that statement with its annexure.
Thank you. The witness statement of Stephen Barry McCann, dated the 25th of October 2021 and bearing the identifier number CRW.998.002.1047 is admitted into evidence as an exhibit.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr McCann, I understand you would like to take the opportunity to address the Commissioners on Crown's remediation program in your evidence in chief.
Yes, I would, please. So, Commissioners, I have a written statement in front of me that I'll read from. I joined Crown on 1 June this year as CEO and Managing Director. At the time I started with Crown, the Bergen report had already been handed down in New South Wales, and both the Victorian and Western Australian Royal Commissions had commenced. I knew from the outset that Crown would need to undertake a rigorous transformation in terms of its culture, its risk and compliance regimes, and its relationships with regulators. I agreed to join Crown in this role because I believed I could help guide it in that transformation and make a significant difference based on my experience overseeing the management of a large, complex organisation in multiple jurisdictions. Crown has been reforming from the board down since before I started in June. The Bergen report, handed down in February this year, acknowledged that Crown had commenced some reforms but recommended additional changes for suitability to commence gaming in Sydney. Since the release of the Bergen report, our reform program has picked up pace across all areas of the organisation. A comprehensive remediation plan provides detail on all of these reforms, and through this we're changing the way we conduct our business. The proposed reforms apply across the entire organisation, including best practice governance, compliance, risk management, responsible gaming, and culture. This morning, the Victorian Royal Commission report was tabled in the Victorian Parliament. The Victorian Royal Commission found that Crown Melbourne is unsuitable to hold a casino licence and recommended that a special manager be appointed to oversee all areas of the casino's operations for the next 2 years. The Victorian Royal Commission found that the reasons for Crown's misconduct include a failure by Crown Melbourne's board to carry out its responsibilities, in particular, its obligation to ensure that Crown satisfied its legal and regulatory obligations. The report also finds that many senior executives at Crown were indifferent to their ethical, moral, and legal obligations. These findings are very sobering. I accept them and will work hard to improve the organisation in every area which the Victorian Royal Commission found lacking. In respect of Crown's remediation work, the Victorian Royal Commission found that Crown had, at great financial cost, embarked on a significant reform program led by people of goodwill and skill. The Commissioner found that the reform program is likely to succeed. Since I started in June, I've been working hard on that reform program. I'm dedicated to transforming Crown from the top of the organisation down. The Victorian Royal Commission report sets out a path forward for Crown Melbourne, and its recommendations will form an important part of our remediation process. The details of those recommendations and how they might be implemented are matters that I have not yet had the opportunity to fully consider. It is something which I'll be dedicating my time and energy to in the coming weeks and months. As an organisation, we will need to work with the Victorian Government and with the Special Manager to ensure a workable, effective system of governance and control is established to enable those responsible and accountable for implementing Crown's reform program to deliver the right outcomes for the community and for all stakeholders. We will also need to consider how the findings on particular aspects can be used for the purposes of Crown Perth. I can say that the remediation process at Crown Resorts is well progressed. There has been significant change at both the board and senior executive level over the past 12 months, and there is now almost entirely new leadership in place at Crown. At the conclusion of Crown's annual general meeting held last Thursday, 10 of the 11 directors present at Crown's 2020 annual general meeting had left Crown. Dr. Switkowski will join the board as chairman following receipt of all necessary regulatory approvals. Nigel Morrison and Bruce Carter have been appointed and now elected new non-executive directors, and we recently announced the appointment of Anne Ward to the board, pending regulatory approval. There's been considerable change across the Crown Group at the senior management level. The management team supporting me in my role as CEO and Managing Director has been refreshed. The new management team is made up of experienced professionals, most of whom, like me, are relatively new to Crown or are occupying new roles under our revised structure. This revised structure has seen key compliance functions separated from operations, with greater transparency and clear reporting lines to the board and board committees. This has also resulted in the creation of new senior positions, including a Chief Compliance and Financial Crime Officer and Chief Risk Officer. We have introduced a new group human resource function to drive cultural consistency across the organisation and appointed Tony Weston as Chief People and Culture Officer. As part of our reforms, we have clarified organisational responsibilities and materially enhanced capabilities and resourcing in our financial crime, compliance, risk management and responsible gaming functions. For example, this year, we have added approximately 70 full-time equivalents across the financial crime and responsible gaming functions alone. In addition, we've implemented other important changes. These include the decision for Crown to cease making political donations and the decision that Crown will phase out indoor smoking at our Australian resorts by the end of next year. There is no question that all of these reforms represent fundamental changes that will strengthen our business. I will continue to work hard to implement these reforms. An important aspect of Crown's remediation process is a renewed commitment to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing programs. Steve Blackburn is Crown's new Chief Compliance and Financial Crime Officer. He is the former head of financial crime at NAB and is leading the transformation of Crown's anti-money laundering capability. Steve Blackburn has attracted to Crown some of the leading AML and financial crime experts from outside of the gaming industry. This means we're applying best practice thinking to our anti-money laundering and financial crime program. This is vital because it will enable us to keep up with the ever-changing challenges present in the world of financial crime. I see Steve Blackburn's role as a crucial part of Crown's remediation process. He and his team have my full support, and I'm committed to embedding the highest standards of governance and compliance across the business, and particularly in relation to AML and financial crime matters. Immediately upon joining Crown, Steve developed and then delivered a bespoke AML CTF training module for all directors and senior management. That training program is now a mandatory training module for all new directors. I completed this training program when I joined Crown in June. I am dedicated to reducing the risk of criminal elements utilising Crown's facilities. Some of the ways Crown is seeking to achieve that aim are by ceasing any dealing with junket operators and by implementing a new significant player review process. This process has already resulted in the exit of a number of historical customer relationships. In addition, Crown has implemented an enhanced approach to source of wealth and source of funds checks. Overall, we've made material progress in implementing significant wide-ranging reforms, and I'm confident that we have a very high calibre team of AML financial crime professionals guiding us through this process. I'm conscious, though, that AML financial crime is an area where you can never say you are done. It is an ever-evolving landscape and there are always going to be new challenges to combat. We will continue to work with experts in the field to ensure Crown is educated on the risks and continually improving its systems. Crown recognises that the responsible service of gaming is a condition of Crown's social licence to operate. We have also entrusted Steve Blackburn with overseeing the enhancement of our approach to responsible gaming. We are strongly focused on embedding a responsible approach to gaming across our business, with enhanced training and a series of changes to the way we manage our business informed by industry experts. We are increasing our dedicated responsible gaming resources by over 40%, expanding and improving our responsible gaming facilities, and adopting a range of changes to play limits and other recommendations, which we are working through with assistance from our independent responsible gaming advisory panel and which are embodied in our RG change program. We're also working with external advisors, researching challenging initiatives such as methodologies to improve oversight of uncarded play. The role of Chief Risk Officer reports directly to me as CEO and has a direct reporting link to the Risk Committee of the Crown Resorts Board. This is a change to the historical reporting structure and reflects the increased importance of risk management to Crown. One of the focuses of Crown's remediation program is enhancing Crown's employees' risk awareness and improving the risk management processes and functions. As part of that process, we have clarified organisational responsibilities and significantly enhanced resourcing in our risk management function. It is an area which we are committed to continuing to improve. I understand the importance of a good risk management process, and Crown is making progress in embedding a new risk culture. It is an ongoing process and one which I'm closely monitoring across the group. Crown's culture transformation program is progressing. And my view is that we are bringing our organisation with us. With the assistance of external experts in the field, this program has involved a detailed analysis of Crown's current culture, including organisation-wide surveys, focus groups, targeted sessions with employees and leadership forums, and the development of a detailed cultural reform roadmap to move Crown to its target organisational culture, which is now in the process of being implemented. I know that we must do things differently to how they've been done in the past. And to that end, a substantial culture reform program is now underway across the business. Following several months of engagement with our employees and business leaders, we now have a renewed purpose statement that together we create exceptional experiences with respect and care for our communities. This reflects our focus on why we exist as an organisation and how we deliver those exceptional experiences. Our purpose is underpinned by our 4 core values. We act with integrity, we work together, we care, and we strive for excellence. The next step will be implementing those values and embedding them into the culture of the organisation. I and all the other leaders at Crown will be assessed on delivery against these values, as will everyone in the organisation. Our policies and procedures will reflect the values, and reward and recognition will be linked directly to them. We are substantially upgrading our processes and systems to make it easy for our people to perform at their best, to manage risk appropriately, and to provide transparent and accurate information. We are creating an environment which will help our people to act with integrity and care, and to speak up around any issues that do not align with our values. An important part of this cultural change process is the hiring of experienced executive leadership to help drive the transformation of the business. The culture starts at the top, and from the senior executive team down, we will expect all Crown employees to adopt our core values and act in a way that is consistent with our purpose. Crown remains a strong and resilient brand. The integrated resorts in Melbourne, Perth and Sydney are world-class. Our dedicated and talented people underpin our premium service and strive to provide exceptional experiences. I'm committed to continuing to drive improvement and positive change. There is a way to go, but I'm dedicated to the remediation process and working hard on its implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr McCann. Commissioners, that is the evidence in chief of Mr McCann.
Thank you, Ms Thornton. Thank you, Mr McCann. Ms Cale.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr McCann, if we can go to your witness statement, please, on the first page at paragraph 6. You say your appointment as Managing Director and CEO of Crown Resorts became effective just under a week ago on the 20th of October, following the receipt of all regulatory approvals. But I assume that those regulatory approvals were not all made on the same day. Is that right?
That's correct.
And when did you receive regulatory approval from the GWC?
Some months back. I can't remember the exact date.
From ILGA? Did you receive regulatory approval from ILGA?
That was the final one on the 20th of October.
And from the VCGLR, when was that?
Again, I think that was about 2 months ago.
And between the 1st of June, when your appointment was made by Crown Resorts, and when you received the regulatory approvals, what role did you play in the governance and management of the affairs of the Crown Group?
So my role was effectively as CEO, but with limitations on how I could bind the organisation in decisions. So I made recommendations to the board for implementation of decisions, but I oversaw the management and governance of the organisation at its operating level.
Well, at paragraph 8 on the same page of your witness statement, you refer to your appointment as Director of Burswood Limited on the 23rd of August 2021. Was that before or after regulatory approval from GWC?
I believe that was after.
Thank you. Now, can I ask you some questions about governance? You're a member of the Crown Resorts Audit and Corporate Governance Committee, aren't you?
Yes.
And you refer at paragraph 37 on page 1052, I think it is, to the committee's work and the reform process, and you say that Crown has been considering the merits of a centralised versus decentralised governance model, but that project has been paused pending the outcome of this commission and the Victorian Royal Commission. So do I understand correctly that Crown Group does not wish at the present time to reach a landing on whether there should be a centralised governance structure or a decentralised one?
Yes, that's correct. There were a number of considerations discussed at the board over previous months, but we took a decision to wait until the outcome of the various regulatory inquiries before we finalised that setup.
So it will stay with the status quo until both Royal Commissions are completed? There
will be likely to be changes required emerging from the outcome of the Victorian Royal Commission, which we will need to work through. That will be specific to Crown Melbourne, I expect. But then subsequently in relation to Crown Perth, there may also be outcomes from this commission, which may lead to a different setup in Perth than in Melbourne, for example.
In terms of Crown Perth, what is the present position in your view as to whether the governance structure is centralised, decentralised, or something in between?
So there are two aspects of the structure, as I would describe them, the governance and the management structure. So governance in the context of board.
I'll just pause. I'm only asking you about the governance structure, not the management structure at the present time.
Okay. So in the governance, the board structure in Perth is such that Burswood Limited, which is the 100% owner of a range of entities underneath that company, is the company that manages and governs the Crown Perth Resort. That company is itself wholly owned by Crown Resorts Limited. So Crown Resorts Limited is the company that is in the position to appoint and remove directors of the Burswood Limited board.
So you can assume that the Commission has an understanding of the structures and who owns who in the corporate structure. The question is, from your point of view, is the Crown Perth structure, a governance structure, presently centralised, decentralised, or something in between?
Governance structure where the oversight of Crown Perth is established is in Burswood Limited, and that's a fully functioning board that makes decisions on behalf of, in the best interests of, Burswood Limited. So that is, in that context, a decentralised structure in that it resides in Perth, and the CEO of Crown Perth, Lonnie Bossy, obviously, and a significant number of management of the Perth business also reside in Perth. There are group roles on the management side of the business which assist the management of Perth and oversee a number of aspects of the Crown Perth management. So that all goes to governance, but fundamentally the board is the governing body.
Right, so if we go to paragraph 29 of your witness statement, page 1051, where you describe the board of Burswood Limited making decisions in its own right in the interests of Burswood Limited, you're conveying there a decentralised structure where the Burswood Limited board has a decision-making role independent of the Crown board. Is that right?
That's right. The Burswood Limited board and its directors need to consider all of the information presented to them and make decisions in the interests of Burswood Limited.
Yes, and then in the next sentence, you describe the decisions of the Burswood Limited board being passed down to Burswood Limited senior management with Mr. Bossy at the top. And you say then Burswood Limited senior management team make the key strategic and operational decisions affecting the Perth casino. Do you mean independently of the Crown Group as directed by the Burswood Limited board?
The operational decisions on a day-to-day basis in relation to the running of the casino are made at the management level in Perth. The key strategic decisions that the management team makes must be approved by the Burswood Limited board.
Yeah, but not the Crown board.
Not the Crown board.
Now, if we just go to paragraph 21 at page 1050, just to clarify your evidence here, you're describing Burswood Limited's head office being based in Perth. You go on in the second sentence to talk about decisions regarding day-to-day operations being made in Perth and the CEO of Crown Perth being responsible for those day-to-day operations. Consistent with what you've said in paragraph 29, the CEO is responsible for and decisions are made in Perth, not just in relation to day-to-day operations, but also key strategic decisions, which are approved by the Burswood Limited board. Is that right?
Yes.
So there's a supplement to that, to the evidence that you've given there, in that it's not just day-to-day operations, it's also key strategic decisions.
Yes, that's right.
And so when you say in the third sentence of this paragraph that the CEO of Crown Perth reports to you, given in your capacity as CEO of Crown Resorts, how does that reconcile with the key strategic decisions being made by the CEO in Perth as approved by the BL board?
So Lonnie Bossy, as CEO of Crown Perth, as it states in my witness statement, reports directly to me in my capacity as the CEO of Crown Resorts. Burswood Limited is a wholly owned subsidiary of Crown Resorts. Ultimately, I'm accountable for the outcomes of decisions that are made that affect shareholders of Crown Resorts Limited. There's no abrogating that accountability through the relationship with Mr. Bossy. I need to work with Mr. Bossy to ensure that any strategic decisions made in relation to Crown Perth are also aligned at a group level with what we're trying to achieve as a group, and that's certainly the way we work together.
Can you direct Mr. Bossy as to key strategic decisions affecting Crown Perth?
Mr. Bossy reports to me, and I am in a position to hire or fire Mr. Bossy with board approval. So from that perspective, yes.
And can you therefore countermand key strategic decisions that the BL board has directed Mr. Bossy to carry out?
No, I can't countermand decisions that the Burswood Limited board has directed Mr. Bossy to carry out. I am a member of that board, and decisions that are made at a board level will be required to be implemented by Mr. Bossy. So to the extent that we have a difference of opinion on a strategic issue, then obviously that's something that we will discuss and resolve and go to the board with the appropriate recommendation.
Right, so, but in your capacity as CEO of Crown Resorts, if you have a different view to the majority view of the Burswood Limited board on key strategic matters, the Burswood Limited board's view holds sway.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, paragraph 22. You refer to Burswood Limited's position as a wholly owned subsidiary of Crown Resorts with the authority to appoint and remove directors. That doesn't necessarily compel a conclusion, though, does it? As I think you're saying, that there's a centralised structure. Crown Resorts Board can still have the power of appointment or removal over the directors of Burswood Limited, whilst at the same time conferring that board with the power to exercise independent authority, delegated or otherwise, to make key strategic decisions.
Yes, but with a bit of a nuance, which is that the Burswood Limited constitution actually operates in a way where, if I can use the term residual powers, that they sit with Burswood Limited. So actually the way that it works in practice is that Burswood Limited, and we've been working through this as a board of Crown Resorts Board and also engaging with the Burswood Limited board in relation to a new charter, is to ensure that those decision-making responsibilities that are to be, if you like, vested in Crown Resorts are spelt out, because if they're not, then they are, under the Constitution, powers that sit with Burswood Limited rather than Crown Resorts. So it's almost counterintuitive to the way that a parent-subsidiary relationship typically works.
Now, coming to that draft charter, which you refer to at paragraph 23, you say that that's likely to come into effect at the next Burswood Limited board meeting, which is scheduled for when, Mr. McCann?
The next official Burswood Limited board meeting is, I think, 10 December.
And you expect it to be approved at that meeting?
I think it's likely to be. We're in discussions about that now, but there may be changes to that once we've been through those discussions.
And having regard to what you say at paragraph 37 of your witness statement that I took you to a little moment ago, and what you've just said to me in answer to some of my questions, that draft charter, which is likely to be approved, is not intended to change the present status quo regarding the current governance model of being an essentially decentralised structure. Is that right?
That's correct.
And do I understand correctly from paragraph 23 that the intention is for the charter to be formally approved by the Burswood Limited board, but not the CRL board?
Needs to be approved by the Burswood Limited board. It'll be endorsed by the Crown Resorts board, I expect. It's already been discussed at the Crown Resorts board level, but we have not approved it because it hasn't yet been put to the Burswood Limited board.
Has it been formally approved or endorsed by the Group Audit and Corporate Governance Committee?
I think it was discussed directly at the board level, so the full board of Crown Resorts, which incorporates all members of that committee.
So just to answer that question, has it gone through the formal process of being reviewed by the Corporate Governance Committee and been the subject of approval, endorsement or recommendation?
I don't believe so.
And is there a reason for that?
No, other than efficiency of process.
Did you have carriage of the preparation of the draft board charter for Burswood Limited?
I had input into it.
You've certainly, informally, not in your capacity as a director of Burswood Limited, but otherwise approved of its contents?
Yes, I did, although there were several versions that went through a draft process. I had input into that whole process.
And presumably the purpose of the charter at its core is to clarify the roles and responsibilities of the Burswood Limited board directors.
It is, and to clarify the way that the operational relationship between Crown Resorts and Burswood Limited works in practice.
All right, if we go to the draft charter CRW.701.009.5375 at page 5381. In section 3, if we can expand that for Mr. McCann so he can see it more easily, the third paragraph, second sentence, do you see there the words, in this regard, the role of the board is to exercise oversight of the management and control of Crown Perth, and then it says, and reporting into the Board of Crown Resorts Limited. Do you see that?
Yes.
So is it intended that the Board of Burswood Limited has a standard reporting function into CRL?
Yes, all Burswood Limited, or all papers that go to the Burswood Limited board are intended to also go to the Crown Resorts board.
But must the Board of Burswood Limited report into CRL board in respect of the decisions it makes?
Yes, that's the expectation.
Is the idea in that regard that Burswood Limited, its board, is accountable to the CRL board for the oversight and management and control of Crown Perth?
No, the Burswood Limited board must consider all issues put to the Burswood Limited board and make decisions in its own right in the best interest of Burswood Limited. It then does report into the Crown Resorts board to inform the Crown Resorts board of those decisions.
So it's for information only.
It is.
Thank you. Now,
Except that's, if I might just clarify that, clearly as a public company with a wholly owned subsidiary, in aspects such as the financial statements, of course, Crown Resorts Board is ultimately accountable for signing off on those financial statements, which would include the financial statements of its subsidiaries.
now at page 5383, section 5.1, under the heading Management of the Business of the Company, have a look at the second and third paragraphs. Is the concept and intention that is sought to be conveyed here that although the Board of Burswood Limited has independent and complete governance oversight for the operation of Crown Perth, it is nevertheless expected to work in close cooperation with CRL?
That is the expectation, yes.
And if we go down to section 5.3 on the same page, thank you. First sentence, insofar as the directors are exercising the delegated authority, etc. The question is this: delegated authority from whom?
That's a very good question. I'm looking at those words and I'm not sure those words necessarily reflect exactly how the Burswood Limited constitution works. So we need to make sure that they do. But the intention is that there's, insofar as the directors are exercising, I think if you took out the words, the delegated authority, and just said responsibility for governance and oversight, I think you would achieve the outcome we're trying to achieve perhaps. So I've just bearing in mind this is in draft form, so it hasn't been discussed at the Burswood Limited Board level yet. So the final words may be slightly different to that.
Well, I thought you were saying a moment ago in relation to the Constitution, there were some elements of it that devolved authority directly upon the Burswood Limited Board, and then separately through the corporate structure there might be authority that's delegated down from CRL.
No, what I was actually saying is that the way that I read the Burswood Limited Constitution, there are a range of responsibilities that are effectively, don't know what the right word is, but delegated upwards to the Crown Resorts Board that require then approval of the Crown Resorts Board. But if they're not specified to require specific approval of the Crown Resorts Board, then they do not.
Understand. Now, section 5.4, can I ask you this question at the bottom of page 5383? That first bullet point at the bottom of 5383, the BL Board is responsible for overseeing the risk, compliance and overall governance culture of Crown Perth. That's intended to convey exclusive and comprehensive governance culture of Crown Perth. Nobody else, apart from Burswood Limited Board, has that governance responsibility. Is that what lies behind that first bullet point?
In the sense of yes, as we discussed, the decentralised governance and control, but I would say that certainly the Crown Resorts Board would all hold themselves accountable and responsible for an appropriate culture across the whole organisation, and we would expect the Crown Perth culture to be consistent with the broader culture of the organisation. So
if we go over to the next page, 5384, and I'm going to nominate the 9th bullet point, which is probably a little hard to find given that the bullet points span over 2 pages. If we just come down to, yes, thank you, very helpfully, the operator has highlighted the responsibility that's itemised there for the board to appoint and remove the CEO subject to the approval and nomination of CRL. Now, that responsibility, how does that interact with what you say is the position at paragraph 21 of your witness statement, and that you explained to me a moment ago that the CEO of Crown Perth reports to you and that you can hire and fire the CEO of Crown Perth?
Well, as with any public company, I think if I, as the CEO, took a decision to hire or fire the CEO of Crown Perth or another major subsidiary without discussing that with the board, that would be probably a foolhardy thing to do. I don't think that is the way things happen in practice. So there would be a discussion with the Crown Resorts Board and they would approve that recommendation. I would expect that if that recommendation was made on a sound basis, it would be approved.
So do you consider that you have, independently of what is good practice, the power to hire and fire the CEO of Crown Perth without reference to the BL Board?
It is part of my job description to be able to hire and fire key people, and that's a typical role of the CEO. But you've asked the question, putting aside practice or good practice, can I do that? Yes, I believe I can do that.
And from whom do you have delegated authority to do that?
From the Crown Resorts Board.
And how does that work if the Burswood Limited Board has exclusive governance oversight over Crown Perth?
Because the Burswood Limited Board does nevertheless consider and make decisions in its own right as a fully functioning board. If I hire or fire other members of the Crown Perth management team, that of itself also would not contradict the role of Burswood Limited in governing Crown Perth.
So the next bullet point on this page similar responsibility, subject to the approval of CRL, the Burswood Limited Board appoints its own directors. Is that what is intended?
That is what is intended, yes.
And is that what's actually happened in relation to the most recent appointments of you and Mr. Carter?
Those appointments need to be considered and agreed by the Burswood Limited Board. They were recommended by Crown Resorts.
Right, but it was actually Burswood Limited Board who appointed you on the 23rd of August.
That's my understanding. It was a Burswood Limited resolution.
And Mr. Carter was appointed when?
I can't recall. I think he may in fact be still subject to regulatory approval. His appointment may be still subject to regulatory approval.
But has there been a formal appointment through company processes?
I believe there has, yes.
Direct.
A resolution has been passed which states that he's appointed subject to regulatory approval.
And who passed that resolution?
I'm not sure I can answer that with certainty, but I'm assuming it was the Burswood Limited Board resolution.
Right. Now, if we go to page 5385, please, and look at section 6.1. This is the distinction you were making before, wasn't it? That separate from a decentralised governance structure, what this draft charter contemplates and conceptualises is a centralised management structure. Is that right?
In relation to some functions, yes.
Yes, specific subject areas, subject matter areas.
Yes, where we think that they'd be enhanced by a global approach, as stated.
So if the Burswood Limited Board has governance oversight in a decentralised way in respect of Crown Perth, that suggests, doesn't it, that the centralised management function would have to be, in respect of management matters to do with Crown Perth, ultimately responsible and answerable to the Board of Burswood Limited and not CRL. Would you agree?
Yes, unless they specified as requiring Crown Resorts approval.
And is that how the structure works presently?
Yes, broadly speaking.
That, for example, in relation to AML or financial crime risk, Steve Blackburn is answerable to the Burswood Limited Board and not CRL in respect of financial crime risk at Crown Perth.
So Steve Blackburn is a centralised role. He reports to me, and he is accountable and responsible to the Burswood Limited Board in relation to aspects of AML and financial crime that relate to Perth. He reports to that board, and those reports to the Burswood Limited Board are then also made available to the Crown Resorts Board as part of Steve's reporting line to that board.
Yes, but that's just a reporting function, isn't it? As I think you explained before, what the CRL board could not do is countermand any direction given by the Burswood Limited Board to Mr. Blackburn in relation to the identification and management of financial crime risk at Crown Perth.
That's correct. I think as a practical matter, there's complete alignment on how we would manage our approach to financial crime across the three resorts, and that's the intention of having a centralised structure in relation to those group functions.
Right. Now,
so in practice, there's no conflict.
Now, the way in which I've just put it to you, and you've responded positively about the governance oversight the Burswood Limited Board has in respect of the centralised management function, is that articulated in writing anywhere? when and the extent to which centralised management roles are answerable exclusively to the Burswood Limited Board and not the CRL Board?
I'm not sure that that is specifically articulated in the way that you've described it. I think it's a combination of governance documents that need to be referred to, including the Burswood Limited Constitution and going forward this charter once it's been formalised.
So it would be something that ought be articulated in this charter explicitly, shouldn't it?
We have certainly in the draft attempted to make clear what the roles are that are managed in a group function versus roles that are managed in a localised function in Perth. So that's certainly what we're attempting to do.
Yes, but the additional point is this, isn't it? When may and when must the Burswood Limited Board direct central management in relation to its function and take responsibility for it as well?
And this is a complex area, so if I misdescribe it, then hopefully that's not in a material way. But as I've said earlier, the way that I read the Burswood Limited Constitution, it's not in fact necessary for us to specify what areas Burswood Limited has control over, because if it is not specified, then it's taken that it does have control. And that's because of the historical way this has all evolved. Burswood Limited was a public company and it's a public company constitution. That constitution embodies some of the regulations that it's required to embody, and changes to that constitution can't be made without ministerial approval. I think once we have finalised the corporate structure, the management structure, the governance structure and the charter, and once we have had regard to the outcomes of this commission, then it may well be that we need to update the Burswood Limited Constitution, but that would require ministerial approval. But it is a document that's somewhat outdated in the context that it's drafted as a public company document, but that's why those powers flow the way they do to a large extent.
But there's a practical element to governance, you would agree?
Yes.
And from a practical perspective, if you have the board of Burswood Limited sitting in meeting with an issue, perhaps about financial crime risk with which it has to deal, and the question is, does the board direct Mr. Blackburn, or does it refer the matter to the CRL board or to you in your capacity as CEO of CRL to direct Mr. Blackburn? The board, in practical terms, needs to understand what the metes and bounds of its governance role is. You'd agree?
Correct, and I believe it does. I think the Burswood Limited Board would direct Mr. Blackburn without having to go to the Crown Resorts Board for approval.
But there might be areas of grey where it's not quite clear whether it's a Crown Perth issue or whether it's a group issue. You'd accept that?
I think if there are grey areas in relation to financial crime, I would hope they're very few and far between.
Moving to the constitution, sorry, I'll put that badly, the composition of the Burswood Limited Board, Mr. McCann. What's your view on the number of directors of that board that should be independent of CRL?
The way that we are currently contemplating that under the charter is that a minimum of one independent director, independent of CRL, is required, and the minimum total board number is 3.
And what's the rationale for only one of the 3 to be independent of CRL?
We are, as I said earlier, certainly intending to have regard to the outcomes of this commission in finalising the constitution of the board. We think that size board is a good size board for present purposes. And in that context, we think one independent director, independent of Crown Resorts, makes sense.
And if I can take you back to page 5381, where the section dealing with the composition of the board is discussed in the charter. One sees at 4.1E at the bottom, at least one of the directors has to be an independent non-exec director of CRL, and then over the page, at least one director must be the CEO and managing director or equivalent, so that's you.
Yes.
Do you say the intention is that there is a further stipulation that's intended that there also be at least one director that's independent of CRL?
It's not a stipulated requirement. That's our intention.
I see. Ought it be a stipulated requirement?
Again, I think we need to consider all of the outcomes of this commission before we finalise the composition of the board and the governance documents that might need to be changed to accommodate any of those outcomes.
Well, you accept it would aid that concept of decentralisation to have a director who is independent of CRL?
Yes, we think having an independent, a director who's independent of CRL would add to that decentralised governance, definitely.
And what is your view on the importance or not of having directors on the Burswood Limited board that are locally based, by which I mean resident in Perth?
I think that's also a relevant consideration. I think it's quite important, in fact, because obviously they will have more local knowledge of the local environment, potentially understanding of the different business relationships that will affect performance of our business.
What do you mean by that? Business relationships that knowledge of business relationships that might affect your performance?
Well, whilst Perth, Melbourne and Sydney are all part of a group Crown business, and we expect consistency of cultures, there are nuances in the way that they operate. And obviously there are local regulations as well that impact Perth that are different to Melbourne and different to Sydney. So local knowledge of how all that works would be a useful addition to the board.
So you mean the regulatory environment rather than business relationships?
Oh, and business relationships. I think, from our perspective, we need to market Crown Perth in a way that maximises the performance of that asset, generates tourism revenue, generates performance, and is conducted in a responsible manner in line with the expectations of the local community. And having a local director would assist in that.
What about the importance of having a local director who has some understanding of the social context of the casino operation, relevant most directly to the social licence that the casino operator has?
I agree 100%, and that's what I was referring to when I said the local community.
Ought it be stipulated, therefore, in the charter that there be at least one local director?
I think that it's something that could be considered. Yes.
Paragraph 24 of your witness statement, you give evidence to the effect that there are no plans presently to increase the number of directors on the Burswood Limited board beyond Mr Carter, Ms Fuster and yourself. And you say that you spoke with... and that is the case, is it?
That's the present intention. But again, as I've said, we do want to have regard to recommendations that may be made by this commission. So we're open to increasing the size of the board, but for present purposes, we think it's adequate.
And you had discussions with Mr Carter, I think, previously about Mr Bossy leaving the board.
Yes.
And you spoke with Ms Fuster about that last Saturday?
Saturday just gone, yes.
And you did so as a reaction to questions Mr Bossy was asked by Ms Fuster's counsel when he was giving evidence the previous day, the Friday, to the effect that Ms Fuster had not been advised of discussions between you and Mr Carter about Mr Bossie's role. Is that right?
No, that's not right.
Well, you had a discussion with Mr Bossie about his departure from the board before discussing it with Ms Fuster. Is that right?
No, that's not right.
All right, will you tell me what happened?
The discussions that I had on Saturday with Ms Fuster were in response to Ms Fuster inquiring about Lonnie's wellbeing post his presentation on the Friday. So we had a broad discussion around a range of things, and obviously as part of that discussion we did discuss Lonnie's future in Perth and his role on the board and the decision for him to come off of the board. But it was prompted by Ms Fuster reaching out to me to have a discussion more broadly about Lonnie's wellbeing post the Royal Commission, post his hearing on Friday. In relation to discussions with Mr Bossie, I have discussed with Mr Bossie on a number of occasions the composition of the Perth board, but I did not, until after his evidence, have a direct discussion about him coming off the board. I believe Mr Carter did, but I don't believe I specifically mentioned that to Mr Bossie.
All right, thank you.
Prior to Saturday.
Now, at paragraph 23 of your witness statement, you say you've not been involved in any discussions about altering the structure of the Crown Perth entities. Are you aware of any discussions taking place on that topic without your involvement?
No, I'm not.
But you obviously have informed yourself about the Crown Perth structure sufficiently to know about the trust structure and which Burswood entity plays which role in relation to that structure?
Broadly, yes.
And you don't disagree that if the Crown Perth entities and that trust structure is not rationalised or changed, that the Crown Perth operation will need to be operated in accordance with the terms of the trust deed?
So again, and as I said, I'm broadly aware of it. I have had regard to the trust deed and the corporate structure, but the way I simplify this is that there's an historic structure. It came about because historically the property trust was managed separately in the typical construction that a REIT would be managed with an external manager. That is no longer relevant because Burswood Limited is now the 100% owner of those entities, and Crown Resorts is the 100% owner of Burswood Limited. So whilst there's an historic structure which embodies a trust deed, the reality is Burswood Limited is in charge of the governance of Crown Perth because it's all of those entities are 100% owned by Burswood Limited.
But if the Burswood Limited board has independent governance oversight of the operation, Perth Casino operation, why would it not adhere to the trust structure that effectively governs in a legal setting how the Perth Casino operation is set up?
Put simply, and this is not intended to be a legal description of the ownership structure, but just a commercial, pragmatic description of what takes place. The Burswood management is owned by Burswood Limited. Burswood Nominees is the licensee owned by Burswood Limited. The beneficiary of the trust is Burswood Limited, and therefore all decisions and governance as relate to the Perth Casino ultimately vest with Burswood Limited. So from the perspective of a director of Burswood Limited, a working knowledge of the historical relationships is relevant, but it's not material in the context of making day-to-day decisions as they impact Burswood Limited, because it's it owns those subsidiaries.
Can I take you to paragraph 28 of your witness statement, page 1051, where this is where you refer to Article 3 of the Burswood Limited Constitution, and you go on to say that you believe that Crown presently complies with that requirement. Is that
Yes.
for the reasons that you explain at paragraph 21, which is at page 1050? Just ask the operator to show you that. Is that effectively your rationale or understanding of why you say that Article 3.12 is currently complied with?
Effectively, yes, because it requires central management and control to be based in Perth, and Burswood Limited is based, based in Perth. The board meetings are held in Perth, and it is a board that operates effectively, making decisions in the best interests of Burswood Limited.
Why do you say central management of Burswood Limited is exercised in Perth?
So again, central management and control, I believe, is the definition of Burswood Limited head office under the regulations. And it's as I think I just described it.
But isn't the management of Burswood Limited split between the local management function and the centralised management function?
So this is a legal definition of central management and control that the regulations require, which is that Burswood Limited does operate as a board, a fully constituted board operating in its own right and making decisions in the best interest of Burswood Limited. The day-to-day operations and management of the resort I would categorise as something different to that, but that's not head office central management and control.
Do you have any view about whether the governance role that you've described that Burswood Limited has in relation to the operation of the Perth Casino should more properly rest with the board of Burswood Nominees Limited on the basis that that's the entity that actually holds the casino licence?
I understand that Burswood Limited is an approved company, and therefore, as the owner of Burswood Nominees, I think it makes sense that central management and control vests with Burswood Limited.
So that,
it would seem odd if it was not.
Well, it wouldn't be odd, would it, to contemplate that Burswood Nominees, as the licence holder, is the one that owes the licence obligations to the state of Western Australia, not Burswood Limited. Therefore, governance of the operation of that licence ought rest more directly with Burswood Nominees. What do you say in response to that proposition?
I understand the point, but Burswood Limited is the 100% owner of Burswood Nominees, so ultimately it controls Burswood Nominees.
Paragraph 30, page 1051 of your witness statement, this is where you address clause 22.1 of the Melbourne Casino Agreement. And I can show you the clause if you wish, or and you should just let me know if you would like to see it. But I'm referring here particularly to clause 22.1 RA3 of the Melbourne Casino Agreement, where Crown Casino Limited has promised to ensure that Crown Resorts, or CRL, maintains the Melbourne Casino as the flagship casino of Crown Resorts gaming business in Australia. Now, I understand from paragraph 30 of your witness statement that you take that clause to mean that Melbourne Casino must be maintained as larger or more prominent than Perth Casino. Is that right?
The exact wording, I believe, in the regulations, it refers to a flagship resort.
That's right.
And it also refers to the preeminent commission-based resort. So they are the requirements of the regulations in Victoria.
Yes, and what I'm asking you is, having regard to your explanation here at 30, which the operator has emphasised for you, you take that clause about the flagship to mean that Melbourne Casino must be maintained as larger or more prominent than Perth Casino. Is that right?
I think, yes, that's a fair interpretation of what I'm saying. Flagship, in my mind, would see us with Melbourne Casino most likely to be the largest and most prominent. Could mean other things. It could be if you have for example, one 6-star resort and in one location and 2 3-star resorts in another location. Some might argue that the 6-star resort is the flagship one, even though it's not larger. But that's how I've interpreted the requirements.
So have you ever turned your mind to whether, as you've just, I think, alluded to, flagship could mean not just size or prominence, but also have to do with the quality or depth of the customer experience that the casino offers?
I think that would be a reasonable factor to take into account. It's one of the relevant factors, yes.
And therefore, do you understand that under that Melbourne Casino agreement, Perth Casino can never offer a superior quality or depth of experience to casino patrons than is offered in Melbourne?
I wouldn't say never. It's unlikely, I would suggest, but I wouldn't say never. Not impossible.
Unlikely that the Perth Casino will ever be of a superior quality to the Melbourne Casino, irrespective of its size. Is that right?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's unlikely that in the context of what the flagship resort for Crown would be, that Perth would be regarded as the flagship resort in contradiction to this requirement. As far as the customer experience is concerned, it's certainly been a vastly superior customer experience in Crown Perth in recent months because Crown Melbourne hasn't been open.
Do you consider that the licensee, Burswood Nominees Limited, has, in a general sense, an obligation to operate the casino licence it has in the interests of and for the benefit of the West Australian community that has granted it the licence?
Yes.
Would that not include operating it so as to maximise the economic and social benefit to the West Australian community?
Yes.
Do you see that obligation conflicting with what I'll call loosely the flagship obligation under the Melbourne Casino Agreement?
Not at all. And I can explain my perspective on that.
Well, go ahead.
So really it comes down to 3 key things, and they are best practice, the network effect and scale. So in terms of best practice, having a group structure with the scale that we have, able to attract the most skillful resources that we can at a group level, should enable us to provide superior governance and management and superior outcomes. The network effect, which is really generated by scale, is fairly well understood in terms of utilisation, driving better outcomes and the marginal improvement from every additional customer that you have in that context. And when you consider both of those issues, and then you consider Crown Perth and what has happened since the acquisition of Crown Perth by Crown Resorts, there's been over $1.5 billion invested in the resort, which has delivered a vastly superior resort than what existed prior to Crown ownership. And the return on investment required to justify that kind of investment could only be achieved through the scale benefits of a group the size of Crown. So in my view, it's very clearly consistent with the best interests of driving the best outcomes for Perth and generation of tourism revenue and generation of state gaming revenue as well. I don't think it could have achieved that without the scale ownership that Crown Resorts brings.
Can I come to your role now as CEO of CRL rather than your role as Director of Burswood Limited? Now, in that role as CEO, you have management oversight and responsibility for the Perth casino operations, don't you?
I have management and oversight, yes, in that the CEO of Crown Perth reports to me.
And is that how, in practical terms, you exercise and discharge that oversight and responsibility function? He reports to you and you give him direction or not as you see fit in relation to what he reports to you about?
He reports to me. We're in frequent communication, and I am provided by Mr. Bossy with a very transparent overview of what takes place in Perth on a very frequent basis.
And just to be clear, so that there's no confusion, harking back to that governance discussion and the questions I asked you a moment ago, you give him direction subject to the overall governance by the Burswood Limited Board.
That's right, yes.
Do you have confidence in Mr. Bossy as the CEO of Crown Perth, Mr. McCann?
Yes, I do.
Do you consider he has the skills and competence to effectively carry out that role?
Yes, I do. He's a very experienced manager of an integrated resort.
Do you consider that he has qualities of character necessary to lead the Perth casino operation?
Since my arrival at Crown, I have had nothing short of a very transparent, open relationship with Mr. Bossy. He keeps me very well informed of what's going on, and I have no reason to doubt his judgment or integrity.
Do you consider he has the skills and qualities of character to drive the necessary cultural change at Perth Casino?
I believe that he will play an important part in that. It's not something that one person can achieve alone, but it's a big job. But he will be an important part of that, is my expectation.
Do you consider it appropriate to retain Mr. Bossy in a key executive position, given that he held a senior executive position at Perth Casino in which he oversaw and shared responsibility for the previous unsatisfactory culture?
So, as I've said, I do think that Mr. Bossy is a very experienced, capable executive, and I believe we have a very open and transparent relationship. In the event that anything emerged that cast doubt on Mr. Bossy's ability to continue as the CEO, whether that's because of past practices or future practices for that matter, then we would look into that very closely and carefully and make an appropriate decision as to Lonnie's role.
Well, isn't there just a more general issue to be dealt with, which is that Mr. Bossy was in a very senior position at Crown Perth for a very long time when the issues that are now the subject of scrutiny by this commission and other inquiries were going on. Is that a concern to you, that a person who has those, if you will, legacy issues continues in a very senior role in the, for want of a better description, new Crown?
So I think Mr. Bossy has, in his own evidence, on more than one occasion, admitted to mistakes in the past and admitted to regrets in not doing some things differently. What it certainly does justify, that history that you've outlined certainly does justify, is for me to have the appropriate conversations with Mr. Bossy about some of those past incidents and his reflection on those and his perspective. I've done that. And Mr. Bossy has explained to me some of the issues that have been raised. I don't think that it's fair to hold Mr. Bossy solely accountable for decisions which he may have had input into, but was not in control of. And I'm aware from my discussions with Mr. Bossy that some of the decisions that were made in the management of Crown Perth were not decisions he would have made if he were the CEO at the time.
Can I ask you now about risk management? You have no experience, or you had no experience prior to joining CRL.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that with the paper.
So prior to joining CRL, you had no prior management experience in respect of casino operations.
That's correct.
And it's fair to say, therefore, that you had no and have no experience-based insight into or understanding of the particular risks associated with casino operations.
That's correct.
You do, however, have experience from a systems and processes perspective in overseeing and managing the development and implementation of a risk management system across a large organisation, don't you?
Yes, I do.
And you are intimately involved in doing that at CRL now, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Both from a governance point of view in terms of your membership of the Risk Management Committee and also in terms of your executive role as CEO. Is that right?
That's right. The Chief Risk Officer reports to me.
Right. The CRL Risk Management Framework is comprised principally of the CRL Risk Management Policy and the CRL Risk Management Strategy. Is that right?
Yes.
And those documents are presently dated around March, April of this year in their latest iteration. Is that right?
That's right.
And those are not documents that you obviously had direct input into at the time because they preceded your appointment?
That's correct, yes.
You have seen the report by the independent monitor appointed by ILGA. It's a latest update report dated the 22nd of September 2021. Is this
Appointed by ILGA.
Yes, sorry, the Kroll report, the independent monitor.
Kroll report, yes, yes.
Can I just take you to that? I'm not sure whether it's the subject of an application, but I'll just ask that it be put on, not on the public screen. CRW.709.162.4600, and at page 4632, the monitor made some comments on Crown's risk management documents, and can you see down there at the bottom, item 27?
Yes, I can.
So this is at the 22nd of September. In the right-hand column, under that column required for phase 2 of the monitorship,
Yes.
identifying further enhancements to the policies and procedures that have to be completed by 31 December. And that includes the risk management strategy. That's not been updated yet?
That is work that is underway. And in fact, we have recently added someone to our team to assist with closing that out by 31 December. Her name's Amy Gleeson, formerly the Chief Risk Officer at Westpac Consumer Division.
And the risk appetite statement also has to be amended?
The way that our current documents work, and as you rightly point out, I wasn't here when they were put in place, our risk appetite statement is a subset of that risk management strategy. Recommendations of independent experts often request or suggest that they're two separate documents, and we may well end up with two separate documents.
All right, but not change the substance of the appetite statement?
We need to reflect on it and make sure that it's appropriate. That'll be part of that process.
All right, if we go over the page, there's reference to a risk and compliance cultural framework. Has that been prepared?
That cultural framework is a subset of our broader cultural reform. And yes, that has been prepared, or certainly in an advanced state of preparation.
And the remuneration and performance processes linked to risk management?
So that is, yes, sorry.
Sorry, that's something, that's work in train, is it?
It is. So there is an overhaul of our performance-based remuneration framework currently underway. It's been discussed at the Crown Resorts Board level, continues to be work in progress, but it will include hurdles in relation to values and culture, and it will include non-financial based KPIs, including in relation to risk management.
What is the timeline for completion of these enhancements, Mr. McCann?
The target was 31 October. We're probably a little bit behind, so my expectation by mid-November.
Thank you. Can I come back to the current risk management strategy, which is CRW 51204100055? And I want to ask you about the 3 lines of defence model, which is expressed in diagrammatic form at 0061. Now that first line of defence, which is devolving responsibility for identifying and managing risks at operational level, in terms of Perth Casino, that means the Crown Perth CEO and other senior executives of Crown Perth, does it?
Yes.
And if we go to the organisational chart, the most recent one for October 2021, CRW.701.009.5021, does the first line of defence rest primarily with Mr. Bossy and then that first line of executives sitting immediately underneath him?
I think that would be right, having just looking at this chart. They're his senior direct reports. So I think, yes, broadly speaking, that would be right.
And the job of these executives in the first line of defence is to take the CRL board's risk appetite and the group risk management framework and implement it at a local level. Is that the case?
Yes.
Does the Burswood Limited board have its own risk appetite?
The Burswood Limited board has been presented, my understanding, the risk management strategy that has been signed off by the Crown Resorts Board and has also been approved by the Burswood Limited Board. That's my understanding.
So as far as you're aware, the Burswood Limited Board has effectively adopted the framework of CRL, including the risk appetite.
Yes.
Now, just returning to that strategy document, CRW 51204100055, we come back to that diagram of the 3 lines of defence at 0061. So there on the left-hand side, that's essentially an oversight function, isn't it? As well as a support function.
That's right.
Yeah. And the idea is that it's intended to be independent of the first line of defence, isn't it?
Yes.
And if we go to page 0065, and we look down the bottom, that second line of defence is explicated in narrative form there. And you can see from the first paragraph that that concept of independence is made clear.
Yes.
Now, how does it, if it also has a support function, does it have a training function as well, the second line of defence?
Well, yes, in the sense that the risk management team under Anne Seegers helps to establish the risk training modules and is also has input, in fact, is the driver of the risk culture framework that we discussed before.
All right, but that support and training, part and parcel with the oversight function, the challenging and holding the first line of defence to account, is all done. There's no overlap. It's quite separate from the first line of defence.
Yes, although I'm not entirely sure when we're talking about training what you're referring to, but there are clearly, for example, standard operating procedures within the casino, those operating procedures are carried out, obviously, by day-to-day operations, and people are trained in those procedures. The second line of defence provides an assurance function, so it oversees the performance of those operating procedures. So both the first line and the second line need to be trained in those.
Okay, so if we go back to that organisational chart, CRW.701.009.5021, the second line of defence is a group management position, is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so if we go back to that organisational chart and look at the group roles at page 5022, so we're at CRW.701.009.5021, and we go over to the group roles page. So can you point out to the commissioners where the second line of defence sits?
So Anne Seegers is the Chief Risk Officer, so the second box from the left, and she's in charge of that second line of defence role.
And are there any second line of defence people who are actually based in Perth?
Yes, there are.
And they answer to Anne Seegers, do they?
That's right, yes.
I see. But that second line of defence in relation to Crown Perth risk management is ultimately answerable to the Burswood Limited Board and the Burswood Limited Board alone.
That's correct, although, as I've said earlier, clearly there's an aligned requirement. So what Anne does in her role and what the second line of defence does in their role is very much aligned between Crown Resorts and Burswood Limited. They're one and the same.
Now, if we come back to that strategy document again, I'm making the poor operator jump from document to document. So that's CRW.512.041.0055 at page 0061. And we see there on the right-hand side the third line of defence, that assurance and testing function as to the effectiveness of the risk management system is essentially what that third line of defence is all about, yes?
That's right.
And it is necessarily and quite distinctly independent of the first and second lines of defence. Do you agree?
Yes.
Are there third line of defence people who are based in Perth?
Yes, there are.
And if we go to the organisational chart, CRW 701.009.5021, at page 5022, where does the third line of defence, where is it represented on this document?
So down on the left-hand side, the second box from the bottom
Mizot.
is just, Mizotna, yes.
And so she would have internal audit officers based in Perth who report to her.
Yes.
And again, ultimately, the internal audit or third line of defence function it answers exclusively to the Burswood Limited Board.
That's right.
Thank you. Commissioner, that's a convenient time.
All right, Mr. McCann, we'll take a break for 15 minutes and we'll come back to, it'll be, I think 5:30 your time. No, 5:45, sorry. 5:45 your time, is that convenient? Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Commissioner.
All right.
Thank you. Please be seated. Thank you, Mr McCann. Ms Cale.
Commissioner. You're right there, Mr McCann, ready to go? Can't hear him.
Yes, I'm ready to go. Thank you.
Now, where we were before the break, I was asking you questions about the 3 lines of defence for the risk management system that Crown now has and who populated each line of defence. I want to ask you now about the Crown Perth ERCC. You're aware of that committee, are you?
Yes, I am.
And its most recent charter, or the most recent one that this commission can ascertain, I'll show it to you, crw.700.094.0323, dated July 2021.
Yes, I see that.
Yes. Has that charter been approved by the CRL Risk Management Committee?
I don't believe so, no.
Do you know if it's been approved by the Burswood Limited Board?
If it was prior to my arrival.
Okay. Now, if we go to if we stay on 323, you'll see the membership there at the bottom of the committee. And
Yes.
you've got the CEO of Crown Perth, as well as the Group Chief Compliance and Financial Crime Officer. That's Mr. Blackburn, is it?
Yes, it is.
And you can see if you go down the list, a blend of Group and Crown Perth senior executive roles.
Yes.
And if we go back up to the top of page 323, under the heading Purpose, the committee's there to assist the CEO of Crown Perth and the board of Burswood Limited, fairly clear that's what it means when you read on, to do the things in the numbered paragraphs below, which includes providing oversight. You see that numbered paragraph 1?
Yes.
For the identification and evaluation of material risks. Question is this: is the ERCC part of the group framework policy and strategy?
No, it's not.
And does it form any part of the first line of defence or the second line of defence?
My understanding of the ERCC is that it is an operational committee, and the purpose is, as described there, to assist in identifying material risks that then need to be escalated. If they are escalated, they would be escalated through the second line of defence to the Burswood Limited Board.
So does the ERCC form part of the first line of defence?
I think, as you can see from the membership, there is a combination of first, second, and third line in that membership.
So how does it fit within the group's risk management framework?
Well, as I said, I think it is it's a management committee, so it is set up for the purpose of those various committee members to discuss and evaluate risks and determine which risks need to be escalated. And I think the combination of first, second, and third line membership is not an unusual combination. So in most organisations, for example, certainly in my experience at Lendlease, we used to run a number of peer reviews where peer reviews would review the work of some of their colleagues. They might be both first line, some might be first, some might be second. It was a regular practice, and I think that the function of this committee is not unlike that.
But does it also review the third line of defence?
It doesn't review the third line of defence, but it has membership from Jessica Ottner representing the third line of defence.
So you've got your 3 lines of defence for risk management. Is the idea of the ERCC that it sits outside of that and is just another broad-based, multifaceted check on the first two lines of defence?
I don't think it has a function of checking on the first two lines of defence. I think its function is to identify and discuss the relevant issues that are part of that risk framework, and then to the extent that they're identified as material risks that should be escalated, they're escalated. There is an ERCC for each of the three resorts, and they all provide that same function.
Well, if you come back to the first three numbered paragraphs under the purpose heading for the ERCC, it's explicit, isn't it, that it has an oversight function in relation to risk identification and management at Crown Perth.
Yes, that is explicit.
Yeah. And the second line of defence also has an oversight function.
Yes.
And the third line of defence has an oversight function.
Yes.
What does the ERCC do that the second or third lines of defence don't do?
So the ERCC has, as I understand it, and as I said, this is something that was established before my arrival. In fact, I don't think the Perth ERCC has in fact met since my arrival. But the purpose of the ERCC is for the team to meet to discuss the issues that they think are worthy of discussion around material risks and to identify those that need to be escalated. So it's not checking, they're not checking the checkers, so to speak. They are having input. So, for example, Anne Seegers in her role or Jess Ottmer in her role would both have insights into the impact of certain risks and their materiality that would be of benefit to the first line to understand, so that when decisions are made, they're made appropriately.
But the support and oversight function of the second line of defence does precisely the same thing, doesn't it?
No, the second line, also assurance, is a completely different role than management. So the second line assurance is overseeing and is checking the first line. And the third line, in turn, is overseeing the second line.
Yeah. So
the first line does do, as I said before, the term I would use is peer reviews. So they do check the work of their own colleagues and they get input from across the group to make sure they do that to the most effect.
So the ERCC has a checking function, oversight function within the first line of defence. Is that how you'd put it?
It's a management committee, so it's in the first line as a committee, but it has input from the second and third line.
All right. Do you think it's important for the risk management framework at group level and the ERCC charter at Perth level to be explicit about how the two intersect?
I think that would be useful.
Can I turn to AML now, please, Mr. McCann? PwC has been retained to prepare an enterprise-wide risk assessment for Crown, hasn't it, focusing specifically on MLTF risk?
That's right, yes.
And that is due to be sent to the CRL board for approval later this year?
That's correct, yes.
And you'd agree that it is vitally important to undertake an enterprise-wide risk assessment so that Crown can understand the gamut of MLTF risk that it confronts across the whole of its operations?
Yeah, that's the purpose of doing the enterprise-wide risk assessment, yes.
Yeah. Is there an enterprise-wide risk assessment being prepared that's not confined to MLTF risk but extends to material business risks more generally across the group?
The risk management strategy endeavours to do that in the context of risk, but the enterprise-wide risk assessment will also have regard to risk management as well as AML.
So the enterprise-wide risk assessment that PwC is undertaking is not confined to MLTF risk?
That's my understanding, yes.
And does it include responsible gaming risk?
I'm not certain that it would go to responsible gaming risk specifically. I'd have to check that.
Coming back to AML and the remediation program that's currently on foot in relation to financial crime risk specifically, have you been able to form any view of your own about realistically when that remediation program is likely to be completed and fully implemented?
Specifically in relation to AML, is the question?
Yeah, financial crime.
Yeah. So firstly, I would say that the remediation, as I think I said in my introductory statement, will be an ongoing issue. So financial crime evolves constantly. So it's not a case of putting pens down and saying we're done on AML. That said, we are, and I certainly am of the view, that with the changes that Steve Blackburn has already embedded into Crown, that we are well progressed in our remediation. Our aspiration is to have an advanced state of AML systems by December 2022. That's our target. We're already at, some months ago, Steve's view was we were at a foundational state, and we've progressed materially from there.
To what extent do you consider that the success of the completion of the development of the financial crime risks remediation program and its implementation is dependent on Mr. Blackburn remaining with Crown?
Well, I think Mr. Blackburn is, firstly, might I say, an outstanding operator, very highly regarded and a very important part of what we're doing. But as with any public company, as the CEO of that company, my role is, a significant part of my role, is to make sure that we have the very best people in the key roles, and that's certainly an objective. If Steve Blackburn was to depart Crown, we would need to ensure we had someone of his calibre in that role. There are sometimes key man risks, but by and large, an organisation of our scale, we would be able to replace any of our key personnel that left, would be my opinion, with appropriate personnel.
Do you mean existing personnel or just the capacity to recruit externally?
A combination. There are some very good people in Steve's team already, and I know from Steve's own perspective that some of those people he would see as very viable successors to his role.
Now, the decentralised governance structure that you described to me before the break means that the Burswood Limited Board will have ultimate responsibility for the implementation, the acceptance of the remediation program and its implementation at Crown Perth. Is that right?
Yes.
So is something being done to keep the Burswood Limited Board apprised of how the remediation program is being developed, and so that it can make its own assessments about whether or not it is on board with that program?
Yes, so at the Burswood Limited Board meetings, at each meeting there is an update provided of progress on the remediation plan and of progress also on the financial crime and compliance plan.
And does the remediation plan, before it's presented to the Burswood Limited Board in iterative form, does that go through the group risk management committee for endorsement beforehand?
The historical practice, I think, has been generally that the Crown Resorts boards, including their management committees, are held prior to the Burswood Limited Board meeting. So that has been the order. Going forward, I think we'll be making some changes to that. We haven't finalised that, but as you can imagine, with a lot of subsidiaries and a lot of committees, there is quite a significant burden on directors in relation to their attendance at board meetings. We need to streamline that and make that more effective and efficient.
At paragraph 40 of your witness statement, page 1053, you say that the shape of Crown's future VIP business has not yet been determined, but that Crown is in the process of developing a plan for this part of the business. Do you mean by that Crown would seek to engage in VIP international business in the future if it were permitted by regulators to do so?
I think it's a point of terminology, so I just want to be careful how I respond to that question. The way that in the casino environment, the terminology is used around junkets and international premium players, etc., and VIP has historically referred to, in the case of premium players, for example, has referred to international customers where there is a group that earn some kind of commission or rewards for bringing those people to the casino. That is a practice we have stopped and not a practice that we intend to re-engage in the traditional way that it's understood. But I could imagine a scenario, as I think my description of the terminology suggests, where a very innocuous group of people that has no association with financial crime or any other concern might come to Crown and might have free meals or some other incentive to do so. If that was to be allowed by the regulations, that might be something we consider. But certainly anything that might provide an avenue for organised crime, absolutely not.
Right. And are you contemplating at the moment that would mean, or what you expect it would mean, is that commission-based international business would not be permitted?
Yeah, I think that that's the traditional definition of junkets, or the significant player programs. So yes, they would not be permitted. It's not our intention to reopen that. I think if we were to do anything in relation to groups of players with incentives or commissions, that would only happen working closely with the regulators to determine what makes sense within the confines of our approach to AML.
Can I change topics now, Mr. McCann, and ask you about gambling-related harm minimisation? You're a member of the CRL Responsible Gaming Committee, aren't you?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that there's an extensive body of academic literature and research on the topic of gambling-related harm?
There is, yes.
Including discussions of the causes of harm?
Yes.
And the relative effectiveness of different models of harm minimisation?
Yes.
Would you also agree there is a significant division or differences of opinion within the academic literature and research in respect of those topics?
Yes, I think that's a fair statement. There's a wide range of opinions.
Would you say that the CRL Responsible Gaming Committee has a unified and coherent view about the causes of gambling-related harm?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I could vouch for the different views of the different individuals on that committee. What I can say is we have done a lot of work in this area to try and make sure we understand the best ways for us to mitigate harm minimisation, or to mitigate harm across our resorts.
So I didn't ask you about the individual views of members of the committee. I asked if there was a unified and coherent view by the committee about the causes of gambling-related harm.
It's something we've discussed and debated. I don't think we have formed a definitive view as to what the causes of gambling harm are, but we have had reference to a lot of expertise in that area. So I'm not trying not to answer the question. I just don't recall us, forming that view and reaching that conclusion on what causes are. We know there's a wide range.
Do you have a view about the causes of gambling-related harm?
I have some views, but again, I wouldn't say I'm definitive either. I know there are a wide range of inputs into what causes gambling-related harm, and I understand also that there's a shared responsibility to try and minimise it. So
let's talk about harm minimisation in a second. I'm here focusing on the causes of gambling-related harm. Could you summarise succinctly, for the benefit of the commissioners, your view about the causes of gambling-related harm?
As I said, I think that I don't have a succinct view. There are a wide range of causes. There are experts in this space that we rely on, and I'm not trying to dictate what the causes are. I think there are, personal circumstances that are very relevant, and then there are also the environmental circumstances that are presented to the individual that can impact on gambling-related harm.
And environmental causes includes the fact and way in which gambling services are offered.
That's definitely a factor, yes.
Would you say that the CRL Responsible Gaming Committee has a unified and coherent view about the model of harm minimisation that is considered to be most effective?
Sorry, the second part of your question just cut out.
Would you say that the CRL Responsible Gaming Committee has a unified and coherent view about the model of harm minimisation that is considered to be most effective?
Yes, I think that we do. We've had a number of presentations in this regard, and we've had a number of recommendations that have been made to us by independent experts, and we've adopted a wide range of those.
So what is the model?
There's a range of interventions that we believe are important in the context of harm minimisation to play periods, for example. There's a wide range of things that we've stopped doing in relation to services that we've provided to customers, which might be seen to potentially add to gambling harm. It's difficult to be concise. There's a lot of things we're doing.
Well, what I'm really interested in is the model of harm minimisation that the committee observes. Does the committee consider that Crown has a responsibility to modify or restrict when or how it offers gambling services in order to minimise the risk of gambling-related harm to patrons generally or patrons individually?
I understand your question. Both.
Does the committee consider that Crown has a responsibility to modify or restrict when or how it offers electronic gaming machines to the public in order to minimise the risk of gambling-related harm?
The committee's formed a view on a number of recommendations, and as I referred to before, one of those is in relation to play periods. That, in our view, is the right approach for us to help minimise harm in relation to EGMs. In the context of availability of EGMs, we have a licence for a certain number of machines at the Perth casino. It's the only place in Perth that has that capacity, and therefore we have a unique responsibility to make sure the way we make those available to patrons is carefully considered.
And that might include, mightn't it, not offering all of the machines that you're licensed to the public to play on?
I think that that's an ongoing consideration that we will continue to reflect on.
You would agree, wouldn't you, that in relation to the general topic of identifying and appropriately managing the risk of gambling-related harm, a casino operator is dealing with an inherent conflict in the sense of profit versus mitigation of risk?
On the face of it, yes, but I am comfortable in reconciling those two things.
Well, isn't the outworking of that inherent conflict that a casino operator such as Crown, if it seeks to genuinely manage gambling-related risk of harm appropriately, it'll need to have the benefit of independent advice that is not affected by the commercial interests that the casino operator has?
I think that the reason that I answered the way I did on the face of it, this goes to the heart, in my mind, of that perceived conflict. And I think there are some comparable situations which I've been involved in my career, which I could refer to. So, for example, the fiduciary obligations of a trustee company managing assets on behalf of unit holders versus the obligations of the employees of that entity managing on behalf of shareholders. I see a similar relationship here. Fundamentally, the short-term interests of Crown as an entity might be perceived to be to maximise revenue from every customer that it can get through the doors. The long-term interests, which I would describe as the maintainable value of Crown for its shareholders, is fundamentally dependent on retaining both the social and regulatory licence to operate. And that is completely aligned with minimising harm and with operating the assets in the best interest of the community. I think Crown's got that wrong in the past, but I think that certainly within our revised cultural framework, it is our aspiration to get that right going forward.
But Mr McCann, the inherent conflict that I described to you and that you yourself identified a moment ago is the reason why Crown's established that independent advisory panel, isn't it?
That's one of the reasons. Getting independent advice from experts is an important part of understanding those interactions.
But the independence of the panel is important to you because Crown could simply employ people with the requisite academic skills and experience to advise it on these technical issues. But the relevance of the independent body is so that it can advise Crown seemingly untainted by the commercial interests that afflict Crown.
I think that's an important part of the role of an independent advisory panel, yes. But I would say there are people within Crown in our responsible gaming roles, our responsible gaming advisors, who are absolutely performing their role without regard to a commercial imperative.
Can I come back to the independent advisory panel, please? Are you satisfied with the operation of that panel?
Yes, I am.
And as to its independence?
Yes.
You're aware it was set up in 2018?
Yes.
Has the membership changed since then, to your knowledge?
I can't answer that question. I'm not sure, but not that I'm aware of.
As far as you're aware, it's headed up by, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, Professor Blazinski?
Yes.
Am I saying his name correctly?
I don't know.
You think I am?
I think it's probably close enough.
Well, let's say Blazinski. And by Professor Blazinski and two of his colleagues at the University of Sydney, is that right?
It's my understanding, yes.
And have you reviewed Professor Blazinski's terms of appointment to the panel?
I have some time back, but yes, I have seen that.
A letter of retainer dated 12 November 2018 that's been produced to this commission is at CRW 540, I need the full, 540011717 on the private screen, I think, not on the public screen. And at 7178, you'll see Professor Blazinski's fee at the top under remuneration, with a base salary of a monthly retainer of the amount specified there, with any significant projects to be undertaken to be paid for separately.
Yes.
Now, if we go, it goes on to say that what the panel is required to do is set out in some terms of reference, which I'll take you to, that set out the functions and objectives of the panel. That's CRW.700.010.0186. And have you reviewed this document?
It's been explained to me. I don't think I reviewed it fully, but it's been explained to me. Yes.
So go to the bottom of 0188 and over to 0189. Objectives and functions. And if we go over to 189 at the top there at 3.2, there's general requirement to provide information, advice, etc. And at clause 4.1, it appears that the minimum requirement is to meet 2 times annually, that panel. And then it says additionally as required, but the minimum stipulation is to meet twice a year for that fee that I showed you, that annual fee, monthly retainer that I showed you in the retainer letter. Does it occur to you that to keep members of the advisory panel on what I suggest is a fairly generous retainer relative to the work required of them and on a long-term basis may compromise the independence and objectivity of the advice Crown receives?
I certainly hope not. I wouldn't think so, no.
What do you say to the proposition that Crown should seek advice from a range of academics or experts to get a breadth of views about approaches to harm minimisation and the effectiveness of different approaches?
We do seek a range of inputs, and we do seek a wide range of research. In fact, we've recently engaged with a group, I think they're based in Canada, a focal group, and that is a paid piece of work as well that we're contributing to. And you're an expert in your field, you're probably entitled to earn a return on your efforts.
So I'm not quarrelling with that proposition, Mr. McCann. What I suggest to you is, might it be better than have a standing panel comprised of these same people on a long-term basis, that you seek advice from experts recommended or nominated by an independent source, such as the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation?
We do talk to the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation, and we seek a wide range of advice. So I don't think the fact that we have this advisory panel in existence prevents us from seeking advice from a range of sources.
But the advisory panel that you have, that's the principal place that you go to for advice in relation to gambling-related harm minimisation, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So we socialise recommendations. So there's currently discussions underway in relation to an enhancement to our responsible gaming plan, which have been discussed and presented to that panel, and we've sought their input. But we have also sought input on a range of things from the foundation and various other bodies as well.
Did the Responsible Gaming Committee have input into Crown's risk appetite statement?
I'm not sure. It was formed I think we've discussed before, it was approved prior to my arrival.
All right. Just the risk appetite statement does not specifically mention gambling-related harm. Do you think it should?
I think that's a fair question. I think that what the risk appetites do, someone's just put it up on the screen, which is helpful. The risk appetite statement, obviously, as risk appetite statements do.
I'm just going to interrupt you to encourage the operator to continue to put that document up there, Mr. McCann.
Okay, no problem. Yes, it did disappear.
I think they thought they'd done the thing, so there we go.
Yeah, it is intended to describe what our philosophy on risk is and what our approach on risk is and what our appetite is. It also defines, and not in this, it must be in this section, I think, somewhere, that we have a zero risk appetite for breaching regulatory requirements. And I thought that it did mention harm or community impacts. I might be mistaken, but that was my recollection.
So the regulatory, the zero appetite for material risk related to regulatory requirements is at the bottom of the page. I think that's what you're referring to, that bullet point down at the bottom. And then if we go over to 0068, you see the second dot point on that page.
Yes.
That's as close as you get, isn't it, to...
Yeah. So that was what I was referring to. So I did understand that there was a reference to social licence and doing the right thing. I think it is intended to encapsulate all things associated with our social licence, which would include responsible gaming. But as I said, I wasn't involved in the drafting of this. I wasn't here. Could it be improved to the point you're making? I think probably could.
Yes, well, it's important, isn't it, to,
Yeah.
given the importance of RSG as an issue, that the risk
Yeah.
appetite be clearly and specifically articulated.
I think that's fair, and I think as part of our revised framework, we need to make sure that that is properly described.
Now, just underneath this, if we can pop that back and look at 7.2 on the same page where we have the risk appetite statement and reporting tolerances. That's all very familiar to you, presumably.
Yes.
RSG falls within this regulatory/legal category on the left-hand side if we go over the page. Do you see that there with responsible service of alcohol?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, the metric for triggering a report to the group committee is expressed relevantly as a material responsible gaming issue, including sustained adverse media. Would you agree that that doesn't really provide sufficient guidance as to when to escalate a risk and when not?
Yes, I think it could be improved. It's not as clear as it could be.
And presumably it's not just to the risk committee that this that a risk needs to be elevated, but in relation to Crown Perth, rather to the Burswood Limited Board. Is that right?
Yes.
So it's actually Burswood Limited and not the CRL Risk Management Committee that has responsibility in this area in relation to Crown Perth harm minimisation risks.
That's right.
Now, can I take you to the most recent version of the remediation plan, which is not for the public screens, but the doc ID is CRW.701.006.4339 at pages 4402, if we start there. That's where the responsible gaming component begins of the remediation plan. And if we pop through to 4406, I want to show you item 43. So there's a responsible gaming change program that is being developed and is planned 1st of December. Is that the idea?
That's right, yes.
And that plan has been developed from advice given by the independent panel?
There have been a number of inputs into that plan. It's certainly been discussed with that panel very recently, I understand.
Yeah. But if we have a look at that third column, do you see where it says at its 15 June 2021 meeting, the board resolved
Yes.
to engage the panel? I assume
Yes.
that was for an additional fee, was it?
I don't know the answer to that question, actually.
But it says to provide advice into aspects of Crown's RG programs, and then these are the words I'm focusing on, Mr. McCann, that have been the subject of criticism by the Victorian Royal Commission. You see that?
Yes.
And is the change program therefore limited to being responsive to criticisms of the Victorian Royal Commission? By which I mean it doesn't intend to more widely identify and manage gambling-related harm risk across Crown's operations.
No, I wouldn't characterise it as that. I think what this paragraph, the way I interpret this paragraph, is it is summarising that the trigger at that 15 June meeting, perhaps, for engaging the panel was partly at least a reaction to the criticism of the Victorian Royal Commission. But in terms of the plan itself, it is intended to be a very fulsome plan that achieves best practice.
But you weren't sure when I asked you a moment ago whether there's an enterprise-wide risk assessment being conducted and completed in relation to RSG risk specifically, are you?
No.
Well, being on the Responsible Gaming Committee, how is it that you do not know that?
If it has been discussed at that committee, then it has slipped my mind, but I can't recall it being discussed in that context.
Is there any reason why an enterprise-wide risk assessment should not be conducted, specifically focusing on gambling-related harm risk?
There's no specific reason, although I would say, and this is a shared view with a number of people, including Stephen Blackburn, that an enterprise-wide risk assessment of itself is an important part of the process that we're undergoing. But the fact that one hasn't been completed doesn't mean that of itself the individual components of our business do not achieve our objective of best practice risk management.
Well,
it's a process.
Well, the bottom line is this, isn't it? In the absence of an enterprise-wide risk assessment for gambling-related harm risk, you simply don't know whether you have identified and managed all of the gambling-related harm risk.
That's probably a fair statement, but I would suggest that we will never know that. We need to continue to get input from experts on an ongoing basis.
Well, an enterprise-wide risk assessment, having been completed, gives you a much better level of assurance in that regard than if you haven't undertaken such an assessment.
I agree with that, yes.
So the best practice that you achieve absent an enterprise-wide risk assessment is more a matter of good fortune rather than assurance that that's what you've achieved.
I wouldn't characterise it that way. I think the word assurance that you just used is the right word. The enterprise-wide risk assessment is an assurance process. It is checking that the processes that you have are best practice. The fact that you haven't done it doesn't mean they're not. And that comes down to people, comes down to processes, systems, culture, everything we're working on.
At paragraph 13A of your witness statement, you refer to a number of briefings you have attended regarding Crown's draft responsible gaming plan. Who has given those briefings, Mr. McCann?
So, sorry, could you just repeat your question?
Paragraph 13E.
E. Okay, sorry,
That's
A
right.
is on the screen, so. Yes, so those briefings have been from a number of people. Sonia Bauer initially, when she was in her role in the Responsible Gaming, EGM Responsible Gaming, or General Manager, I think, Responsible Gaming. Steve Blackburn, and also Nick Emery, who's our Chief Marketing Officer, who's been heavily involved in this because a number of the people involved in our data analytics report into Nick.
You mentioned recommendations of the panel most recently presented to the Responsible Gaming Committee on the 7th of October. Those updated recommendations have not been produced to the Commission. What do they say?
There are a range of, it's quite a long list of potential enhancements. So there is a summary of the recommendations made. Not all of them are recommended to be adopted. The vast majority are, and they range from play hours, for example, the way that our technology works in relation to the Splunk system notifying responsible gaming advisors when there's an issue. They also discuss cardless play and the need for us to do further research on that. So there's a range of things on that list. I can't recall all of them from the top of my head. Is
it envisaged that the 12-hour play limit for EGMs will be reduced?
No, not currently. That is currently actually being rolled out in Perth as we speak. There are operational issues associated with making that work properly. So, for example, differentiating between people who are there as a hotel guest versus people who are actually gambling. If they're non-carded players, that becomes more complex. So we've got to make sure we round out all of those issues, but there's no intention to change that.
When you gave your evidence in chief earlier this afternoon, you mentioned that there had been about an additional 70 people joining the management team across financial crime and RSG. Do I have that correct?
Yes.
How many of those 70 are RSG positions?
Exactly 16.2.
And that represents, if I understand your evidence in chief correctly, a 40% increase on what there was previously.
Yes.
Now, you're aware, obviously, Mr. Blackburn is the primary person responsible for the responsible gaming area of Crown Group.
That's right, yes.
But unlike his expertise in financial crime, he has no background or expertise in gambling-related harm minimisation.
That's right.
You consider it appropriate for him to have overall responsibility for the RSG area, given his lack of experience and given his significant commitments to the financial crime risk area?
Yes, I do. I think Steve is an outstanding executive. Obviously, it's a steep learning curve on responsible gaming for him, as it has been for me. But part of his role, like mine, is to make sure that he has the best possible team. I know he's well advanced in the recruitment of an EGM for responsible gaming. I have seen a short list of candidates. There are some exceptional candidates that have applied for that role, and I don't think we would have that calibre of candidates if we didn't have a person like Steve Blackburn overseeing it.
Would you have appointed Mr. Blackburn to the financial crime risk role he has if he had no background in financial crime risk?
Probably not, but that was an appointment made before my arrival. But as you've already pointed out, I have no prior casino experience, but I think I can do a serviceable job as a CEO, hopefully better than that.
But just coming back to Mr. Blackburn in that specific role of financial crime risk, for you now, you didn't make the appointment, but for you now it's important that he has that expertise, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's quite a technical area, and his expertise in that area is very helpful.
You don't think that RSG is a technical area?
RSG is a complex area. It's not technical in the sense of the rules and regulations that need to be applied. It's an issue, as we talked about, going to the social licence to operate. It's an area of responsibility. It's not a heavily regulated area.
Aren't the issues of the causes of gambling-related harm and appropriate harm minimisation models completely technical?
No, I don't agree with that. So, for example, at Crown, we will have at any given point in time several thousand people coming in and out of our doors, and we'll have several hundred people at Crown Perth working within the establishment. It is my intention that the entire organisation is focused on the responsible service of gaming. I don't expect them all to be responsible gaming experts with technical knowledge. I expect them, though, to approach their roles with the right degree of social responsibility. And that's something we haven't achieved historically, but we will achieve going forward.
So we're talking about Mr. Blackburn, not everybody in the RSG.
I'm differentiating between technical requirements and the requirements to exercise care for customers in the context of harm minimisation, which I don't see as a technical requirement.
All right. The change program that is being sought to be developed and implemented for RSG in the Crown Group, is that fundamentally underpinned by an adoption of the Reno model?
You'll have to explain the Reno model to me.
You don't know what the Reno model is?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Is that not a technical issue that you might need to know about?
It may be. It's not a term I'm familiar with.
Can I come to the Crown Perth local remediation plan, Mr. McCann? We learnt from Mr Bossy last Friday that Crown Perth has a local remediation plan. And indeed, it appears it has a Crown Perth Remediation Planning Committee. Are you aware of both of those things?
I am now, but I only became aware of them following Mr Bossy's evidence.
All right. Do I understand correctly then that that committee doesn't report to either the Burswood Limited Board or any management position within the Crown Group structure?
No, it's a group that Mr Bossy has established, which is intended to operationalise what we are pursuing in our remediation plan at the Perth resort specifically.
So is it a committee that basically is intended to implement and therefore conform to the group remediation plan or plans?
Yes, to the extent that they relate to Crown Perth.
And to the extent that they've been approved by the Burswood Limited Board, is that right?
Yes.
Do they need that imprimatur from the Burswood Limited Board before they can proceed to implement a remediation plan from Crown Group locally?
I think the remediation plan itself is a plan that we manage at the Crown Resorts level. That plan evolved some time ago, actually. I think it was first put in place quite some time ago and was added to as a result of the outcome of the Bergen report and will continue to be added to. I expect, though, that there will be probably a separate plan that will emerge from the outcomes of the Victorian Royal Commission, and there may well be a separate plan that emerges from the outcomes of the Perth Royal Commission. So they are working documents to help us set targets within the management of Crown Perth itself. I expect Lonnie would have a range of meetings and committees to help operationalise all of those things, and he wouldn't need to go to the Burswood Board for approval of that. It's expected in the job to implement and operationalise the remediation plan as it applies to Perth.
Yes, it's just whether that remediation plan first has to be approved by the Burswood Limited Board before Mr Bossy can do anything to implement it.
It does need to be approved, but I guess the reason I might be sounding indirect on this is because I think there are other forms of remediation. I expect Lonnie might form his own judgment are required, and he might raise some of those with me. He may not, on the basis of materiality, feels he needs to, but I'm certainly not going to refrain Mr Bossy from implementing other forms of remediation external to that plan if they make sense in the operations of Perth in a responsible manner.
Well, can I ask you about that? If you have a look at the Excel workbook that is the most current version of this implementation schedule that Mr Bossy is working with his committee, you can see, amongst other things, that there's a plan for amending the existing standard operating procedures at Crown Perth, at least insofar as they relate to AML. Now, is that something that is in conformity with or otherwise in conflict with the remediation plan that Mr Blackburn has for AML, including a general policy uplift?
I can't answer that question on the specifics of what's in the plan. As I said, I only became aware of it very recently, but I would certainly hope that it's not inconsistent.
Well, the amendment of standard operating procedures at Crown Perth, who does that have to be approved by?
So standard operating procedures are procedures that we implement to operationalise our control mechanisms, and they need to be approved by Mr Bossy.
And Mr Bossy alone?
In the context of financial crime, no. He would need to obviously ensure that they are also approved by Mr Blackburn.
And is that happening to your knowledge?
Certainly hope so.
You don't know?
Well, I trust both Mr Bossy and Mr Blackburn as senior executives to do their role well. I know they talk frequently, so I'm assuming that there's no differentiation or conflict between what Mr. Voss is trying to achieve and what Mr. Blackburn's trying to achieve.
Right, now, Mr. McCann, can I talk to you a little about cultural change? You have that primary responsibility within the group for driving cultural change, don't you?
Yes, I'm working closely on that with the Chief People and Culture Officer, which is Tony Weston.
And ultimately, you'd agree it's the improvement of culture that's of critical importance to the effectiveness of the remediation programs that are presently being developed and implemented.
Yes, that's right.
You gave evidence to the Victorian Royal Commission not long after you arrived at Crown and made some observations about the culture of Crown as you saw it at the time. Just on the hearing room screens, please, your witness statement of 15 June 2021, that's CRW.998.001.0459_R at page 0465, paragraphs 28 and 29. You're referring there to the previous chair identifying the need for a cultural overhaul of Crown by the CEO, and this is in the context of the discussions you had leading up to your appointment with Ms. Coonan. Then if we go to page 467 at paragraph 34, first sentence, this is at June, you say, based on your current knowledge of the challenges facing Crown, I'm confident these can be addressed relatively quickly over the course of several months, and the these is a reference to Crown's failings, including the need for cultural overhaul. Would you agree that you probably didn't appreciate the enormity of the task when you said that?
I may have underestimated the enormity of the task in some areas, and certainly the report from the Victorian Royal Commission is a sobering read in relation to some of the practices that did apply in the cultural issues. There's been a lot of work done on this over the last several months, and I think we're well progressed on this journey. So I'm confident that we will achieve our objective of the cultural overhaul that we've set ourselves.
Well, we're now several months down the track from June when you made this statement. You would accept, wouldn't you, that cultural reform has not been completed as I stand and you sit here today?
I agree with that, and that's not what I read my statement to said would happen. To have said what would happen. To have said would happen. Completed really depends on what you're talking about when you say completed. So what I would say is there are two very significant steps here. One is the climate that we operate in. Have we done the work to reset the climate within Crown? Yes, we have. Is that well progressed? In my view, very well progressed. Are we able to measure the success? Clearly not. That takes time. We need to measure that we need to assess the embedment of that culture, and then we need to measure our performance and make sure that it's sustainable. But the first thing you have to do is reset the climate, which I believe we're well advanced on.
You didn't, at the time of your witness statement to the Victorian Royal Commission, have access to the Deloitte Cultural Review, did you? That was provided in July 2021, I think.
That's right. Yes, I think that's right.
And if we just go to that CRW.701.004.9441, the executive summary at 9447, right-hand column, some overarching findings in the numbered paragraph 1. They're talking there about a culture of compliance not yet embedded. Would you say the culture of compliance has now been embedded across the Crown Group?
This is an interesting area because I know that some experts have said that there is no such thing as a culture of compliance. So our culture requires an element of that to be a strong focus on compliance. I believe we do have a very strong focus on compliance across the group. There's always room for improvement, but I believe we've made very good progress in that regard.
In relation to numbered paragraph 2, which is focusing on the senior management level and how it's perceived by middle level managers and lower. Do you say that those perception issues have been resolved yet?
I'm just reading. Could someone actually enlarge that a little bit, please? Sorry. Okay, thanks. My eyes are not what they used to be. So yes, that was a disappointing statistic to read in the culture survey. I think that we have improved materially. We haven't done another survey yet to measure our success, but we will be doing that on an ongoing basis. So we need to continue to measure improvement and make sure that sentiment has shifted materially.
In your witness statement to the Victorian Royal Commission at paragraph 35, you stated that in your view, achieving the transformation required did not require a massive replenishment across the various layers of the organisation. Do you still hold that view?
Yes, I do. And what I really was referring to here is that Crown employs thousands of people across the organisation, a number of contractors as well as direct employees. And as I said at the time, and obviously please keep in mind, I was 2 weeks into my role when I wrote this, so I've learned a lot since, there's no doubt about that. But my observation that there was a real desire amongst the what I would call frontline workers at Crown to see change and to be supported in that change and to have strong direction from the top was palpable, and that remains the case today. What has been called out in the Deloitte survey, amongst other things, is what I think they refer to as the permafrost layer, which I can attest to being not unique to Crown. That's something that exists in most large organisations. It can be harder work to break through that layer, hence the terminology used, and I think we probably still have more work to do there.
So if we come back to the culture review, numbered paragraph 3 at page 9447. I need to read it out again. CRW.701.004.9441. Thank you. At 9447, numbered paragraph 3 focuses more particularly on the middle management level of the organisation. Would you agree that at Crown there is a need to drive cultural change at the middle management level?
Yes, I agree.
And how best is that done in practice in your view?
I think there has to be a combination of things, and we're working on all of those. So communication and the rigorous reinforcement of consistent messages. We have worked as a team to reassess our purpose and values. That has been an area of significant engagement amongst middle management, and they've had a lot of input into those discussions. We need to now make sure that everyone from the top down, including that layer of management, genuinely buys into those values and the behaviours that are associated with them and sets that example on a consistent basis. That is something. So again, going back to, when are you done? You're never done, but in terms of measuring the improvement, it's too early to say how far embedded that is in the organisation, but I'm confident that we've made great progress.
Now, I asked you previously about the CEO of Crown Perth specifically, but more generally across management, and including here particularly middle management as a cohort. What is your view about the wisdom of retaining people in key management positions who have overseen and share responsibility for the past unsatisfactory culture?
I think that to the extent that someone is responsible or accountable for bad behaviour, we need to look at that very closely, and people need to be assessed fairly and rigorously. We shouldn't jump to conclusions, but there's no doubt as our chairman-elect said in his evidence, there will be a transition and some people won't survive that transition. It's going to be a rapid transition.
Can I ask you about the statement of purpose and values that Crown now has and to which you referred in your evidence in chief? Those have recently been changed a little, haven't they?
They have.
Why?
That was part of the work that we did with Deloitte and internally. About, I think back in 2019, a piece of work was undertaken, driven actually largely by Crown Perth, around establishing purpose and values or improving our existing purpose and values. We revisited that work. We asked the specific question as to how we can make our purpose and values more aligned with how we want to deliver our services and why we operate as an entity. And a lot of that goes to the social license to operate. And
so it's just an outworking of that advice then, effectively?
Not advice. It was the survey was the starting point. We received advice on what our current state of culture was. We then ran a number of focus groups with our employees and a number of senior leadership groups as well. So it was the team that actually developed that purpose and those values. It wasn't advice. We were assisted in that.
Right, thank you. Now, coming to GWC, have you had any engagement with the WA regulator yet?
No.
But you intend to?
I do. I think it's been, obviously, given the Commission is on currently, there's been limited interaction with GWC in recent times.
And I assume you've been briefed about some of the evidence heard by this Commission regarding the previous relationships between certain officers of the GWC and officers of Crown?
Yes.
Yeah. What, in your view, is the appropriate posture that Crown should adopt with respect to the regulatory relationship and its dealings with the regulator, both at an organisational and individual officer level?
We must have a very transparent, open relationship with all of our regulators. It should be very much at arm's length. It shouldn't be a social relationship.
Thank you, Mr McCann. Nothing further, Commissioners.
Thank you. Do we have any counsel out of the room? No. Are there any applications? No.
Thank you. Mr McCann, just a couple of questions. Mr Finkelstein, in the report in relation to the Victorian Royal Commission, has made recommendations concerning the management of Crown Melbourne, to the effect that its management must only be answerable to the Melbourne casino operator. Are you aware of those recommendations?
At a high level, yes. I haven't had time to fully absorb the implications, but yes, I'm aware of them at a high level.
Well, by all means, tell me that you're unable to answer this question. If those recommendations were implemented, would that restructure have flow-on effects to the management of the Perth casino? And I'm thinking in this regard that it seems that Crown's current operational structure is that whilst there is local management at both Perth and Melbourne, there's also reporting of that local management through to group roles and ultimately to the CRL board. It would seem that Mr Finkelstein's recommendations may cut off ultimately some of that reporting through to Crown group roles and the CRL board. And I'm just wondering if that was the case in Melbourne, would there then be an associated change to the same reporting lines or parallel reporting lines from the Perth casino?
And you'll have to excuse me for not providing a complete answer, but my response to that would be that my understanding is in Victoria there will be a series of recommendations that the Victorian government will legislate on in the very short term, and a range of recommendations that it will legislate on subsequently. And I would expect that there'll be a period of consultation and discussion around how they would be embodied. So, for example, around corporate governance and management, there will need to be a workable structure that enables Crown Resorts as a listed company and the ultimate parent company for the directors of Crown Resorts to fulfil their duties as directors. So how that quite fits with what's being recommended, I think there's a bit of work to be done to understand that better.
So the question as to whether that might then, whatever is worked out there, affects the approach taken to the management and governance of Burswood is unclear. Would that be right?
I think it's unclear. It's unclear in relation to Melbourne as well as Burswood, I would say, and it needs to be clarified. And then, of course, we also need to have regard to whatever the outcomes are and recommendations from this commission.
Then the next question I had related to some of those same issues, and it has regard to the board membership of Burswood Resort Management Limited and Burswood Nominees Limited. To date, those boards have been executive boards. And I think with respect to answers to Ms Cahill, you said that there was still a lot to be worked out in respect of subsidiary boards. But is it your view that they should remain executive boards?
I haven't turned my mind specifically to that question, and the reason for that is that there is actually an astonishing number of subsidiaries in existence around the Crown Group, and we've had a very material change in our directorship. So we are looking at all of those boards and looking at making sure that we have the right composition. Intuitively, I would have thought it's logical that the same board members sit across each of those boards in Perth. To me, one of the things we haven't done so well is set up a reporting system and process that's efficient. We have a lot of meetings that consider various documents and reports on a repeated basis, and I think we can streamline them by having common membership of various subsidiary boards.
Thank you for that. My next question was if you had given some thought to that and thought that they should remain executive boards, is how does that affect the reporting lines from those boards through to either CRL or Burswood Limited? That is, to whom are they ultimately responsible?
Yes, I have. So I am, and I'm maybe oversimplifying, but as I think I referred to earlier, it is a complex structure in Perth, which is historical, but fundamentally Burswood Limited is the owner, 100% owner of the relevant subsidiaries, and Burswood Limited is therefore the entity that is in control. And the licence sits with Burswood Nominees, but Burswood Limited, as an approved company, has the ability to control Burswood Nominees and every other subsidiary entity. So I think from our perspective as Crown Resorts, the important thing is to ensure that the reporting and governance and oversight in Burswood Limited is what it should be.
And my final question was in relation to the clause 22 of the Victorian State Agreement. In relation to this issue at paragraph 30 of your statement to this commission, you referred to the size of the cities, Perth and Melbourne, and the economies. I'm just wondering what What relevance does that have?
Sorry,
Paragraph
just give me,
30 of your statement could be brought up.
just give me one moment, because this laptop that I'm on is telling me it's about to log me off. So I just need to make sure it doesn't. Okay, I think I've solved that. I'll have to dial back in if I failed. So just reading that now. Apologies. Yeah. So the point I was trying to make there, perhaps poorly made, is that, you know, when you look at that requirement and the way that it's certainly the way that it's interpreted within the parochialism that has definitely emerged in Victoria, is the desire for the Melbourne casino to be the flagship casino is interpreted to include scale in that. I think that one of the points that I'm making here is, as an economy, a larger economy, it is, we expect, and I think probably self-evident, that on an ongoing basis, the revenue generated from Melbourne is likely to exceed the revenue generated from Perth. And as a commercial entity, clearly one of the things that determines our capacity to reinvest in our assets is the profit margin that we generate and the return on capital for investors that gives us the capacity to reinvest. So on that basis, I think scale does become relevant in the capacity to continue to maintain one resort as perhaps the flagship resort versus others. And that's really the point that I was trying to make, but I don't think I made it particularly well.
Because when in the Melbourne Casino Commission, this matter was under consideration. Crown was not making that same point with respect to Sydney and Melbourne, was it? Wasn't saying that Sydney had to be the larger casino because it had a larger population and economy than Victoria.
No, I don't think that is what we said. I think that certainly the discussions around the Sydney resort, and at the time that the licence was granted for Sydney, there were discussions with the Victorian government, and those discussions went to the quality of the Sydney resort and its capacity to, amongst other things, attract international tourism at a scale and at a price point which would add value to both the New South Wales and Victorian economy. So it is not perceived within Crown that that Crown Sydney is a competitive asset versus Crown Melbourne. It's perceived within Crown that Crown Sydney is a competitive asset versus Star. And I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that the only imminent threat that a resort other than Crown Melbourne could potentially become the premier resort in the country would be a threat from Star, not from within Crown.
So in respect of clause 22 and the various parts of it, do you agree that it requires CRL, both at CRL level and in its control of the Melbourne casino operator, to operate the Perth casino in a way that is not detrimental to Victoria or the Melbourne casino, and in a way that in effect puts the Melbourne casino and Victoria's interests above those of Western Australia?
I think the first part of what you said, Commissioner, is right, that not to the detriment of Melbourne, but the second part I don't agree with. And this goes back to what I said earlier around the benefits of scale, the network effect, best practice. All of those things are best achieved by having an organisation which has the capacity to attract the best talent and the cheapest capital to enable it to continue to reinvest. And I think it is very clear to me that Crown Perth as an asset is a vastly superior asset today than it was prior to Crown's ownership. And that's a direct consequence of Crown having invested over $1.5 billion into that asset. And that has not been at all to the detriment of Crown Melbourne. In fact, it's enhanced the Crown brand and reputation. Now, obviously, we've got some serious issues we're dealing with at the moment around what we've done to damage that brand. But in the context of the quality of our resorts, having an absolute first-class resort in Perth is an enhancement both locally and internationally to the status of the Crown brand. And that benefits Melbourne.
Thank you, Mr McCann. I don't have any questions.
Mr. McCann, I've got a couple of questions for you. Can I just ask you this? And I only want to put this to you, and I'll leave it at that for the time being. Do you regard Crown Perth as being a resort complex comparable to international first-class hotel and casino complexes, taking into account its size, location and primary markets? Do you want me to read that again?
No, I think that's I've got that covered. Yes, except for the fact that there's a very small component of international revenue in Crown Perth.
Thank you.
So most international resorts would probably have a far greater international component of their revenue.
Right. On a different topic, there's a series of questions that Ms. Cale put to you, and if I can paraphrase or summarise, it's to the effect of how do you take into account the deficiencies of the past and develop and remedy them by developing a culture for the future. You remember there was a series of questions along those lines?
Yes, Commissioner.
There's no need to bring this up, but at page 3612 of the transcript of the Victorian Royal Commission on the 7th of July, Ms Holton gave evidence, and one of the things that she said was she was commenting on your arrival, which was then quite fresh, and she said, Mr McCann is going to make an assessment about all of our senior management team going forward. That was her evidence to the Victorian Royal Commission. Is that happening?
Yes, it is, Commissioner.
Right. And over what period would you expect that to take place, to continue?
I would there is it's an ongoing part of my role, obviously, continue to do that. But at the senior management level, which is, I would categorise perhaps as my direct reports. When I joined Crown, there were 17 direct reports to me. There are 9 now. I don't expect it to be more than 9 going forward. There are a couple of roles within that group that are likely to change going forward as well. And we are very close to appointing some new senior executives. So, for example, a CEO Sydney and a new head of external affairs. So it's an ongoing process. I would certainly hope that within the next 6 months, I could say that my team is stabilised and at the quality that they need to be. And then there'll be other changes, no doubt, on an ongoing basis in that middle management level.
Thank you. Now, I've got a couple of questions, they're related, I think, about the Crown Perth, the subsidiaries, in particular the 3 companies in Perth, Burswood Limited, Burswood Resort Management Limited and Burswood Nominees Limited. Now, again, I'm trying to summarise here. I think your evidence to Ms Cale about the structure of those companies was something along these lines, that it's an historical structure, and you have to take into account that Burswood Limited it started as a property trust with a separate management company. Not surprising, because it was a professional trustee that was the trustee and that held the registered ownership of the assets, including the licence. So that's not surprising, but you get to a stage where it becomes a public company, and so the governance, then the focus of governance shifts to the public company rather than to the manager and the trustee. So that the structure is an historical accident or a part of history, and that the reality is that you're looking at Burswood Limited for governance. Is that a fair summary of what you were saying?
Yes, that's certainly how I see it and how it's been described to me.
Well, can I put this to you? That even accepting that that is the reality, that it's difficult effectively to ignore the trust structure for this reason, if for no other. And that is that the trust structure is recognised in an act of the West Australian Parliament.
Yes.
Does that affect the approach that you would take to this focus on Burswood Limited and, if I can put it this way, a lack of attention to the trustee and the manager?
And if there is perceived to be a lack of attention to the trustee and manager, that's certainly not the intention. It's that we see it as encapsulated in the structure, with Burswood Limited being the ultimate owner. I can understand your point. However, as I think I alluded to before, the Burswood Limited Constitution and indeed the regulations obviously require ministerial approval. They might even require an act of Parliament to change. I'm not sure why that wasn't done when Crown, or PBL as it was then, privatised Burswood. I expect that there are a combination of factors, including cost, stamp duty and other things that may have gone into that decision. But certainly, in my perspective, they should have all been changed at that time, and ministerial consent should have been sought to tidy up the structure so that this issue was not an ongoing source of concern. Perhaps post this commission, we should be engaging with government to make sure the structure does work as it is intended to, and that the governance is very clear.
Thank you. And my last question comes to Burswood Limited itself, and it's the current position of 3 directors. Can I ask you this? Crown Perth is an organisation that, as I understand it, has roughly 6,000 employees. It's got revenues, according to the annual report, of annual revenues of about 700 million. I think we heard evidence that there can be 8 to 10 million people that cross the site in any year. That is on any view, a very significant undertaking. You'd agree with that?
It is, Commissioner, yes.
Can I put this to you? A board of 3 that is asked to exercise a full suite of governance responsibilities and take governance accountability, that it is a very large task for a board of 3 to take on all of those functions and do it in the way that directors' responsibilities require. That's the first part of it. And the second part is that, and it is a particularly difficult task for a non-executive independent director, a sole non-executive independent director who doesn't have access to day-to-day knowledge of the organisation.
Yes, so we have, obviously there's been a lot of change at the various levels of Crown in the various boards and committees, and that's an ongoing thing. The minimum requirement is 3. That's a legislative requirement, as I understand it, which we've adopted in the draft charter, but there's nothing that that I don't see any issue with us increasing the size of the board. It's not currently under contemplation, but a significant part of that reason is that we do believe we need to await the outcome of the Royal Commission, and we need to assess and have regard to recommendations that may emerge from the Royal Commission. So we're not trying to preempt it, but nor are we saying we're locked in stone at 3. I agree with you. It's a big task. I think it's a very high quality. I hope it's a very high quality board. I'm one of them, I suppose. So that's probably self-serving, but I hope it's a very high quality board. And, I've no reason to believe we can't do our job well, but we're certainly not adverse to adding directors to that board.
And if a view is taken that the true nature of the operations of Burswood Limited is such that it would benefit from having its own set of board committees, not in competition with the Crown Resorts Limited board committees, but nonetheless its own set of committees, that would be very difficult to implement with a board of 3.
Yes, I think inevitably they'd be the same people in that situation. So yes, I agree with that.
And my final question is one that came out of the evidence of the chair-elect yesterday, and he made it clear that this was his personal view and not something that he had canvassed, I think, with other board members. But the increase in the size of the board of CRL by a couple of additional directors, and one of the considerations of that would be geographical, which might open the way for a Perth-based director to go onto the board of CRL. Is that something that you've contemplated?
Yes, it is, Commissioner, and we haven't, as the chairman-elect referred to, we haven't formed that view, but we have discussed that as a potential direction. And
would you see that if it were to occur, that might increase or assist the arguments that the control and management, the effective control and management of the Burswood entities should reside locally?
I think yes, I can see that assisting. I would make one observation, which I think is important to make in the context of this discussion, or two perhaps. First is this is clearly a board decision and not mine as an executive, but there will be ongoing discussions around how that ultimately looks and what the right composition is. In the context of governance and control and management, the other issue, and this is, perhaps goes to the previous question a little bit as well as to what's coming out of the Victorian Royal Commission's recommendations, we need to ensure that people who are ultimately held accountable for outcomes, so for example, me, in my role as the CEO of Crown Resorts, I am entirely comfortable with the notion that whilst I might be able to dodge the bullets from the past, I am entirely responsible and accountable going forward for things that go wrong. For me to be responsible and accountable, I need to be able to be in a position of being able to do my job, which requires control on certain decisions. The same applies, I think, for directors of a public company board. So the way that the various boards are constituted or comprised and the way that the management structures are comprised, I think needs to be set up in a way that directors can perform their duties appropriately, and as can management.
Thank you, Mr. McCann. Anything arising, Ms. Cale?
No, thank you.
Ms. Thorne?
Thank you.
No re-examination. Mr. McCann, thank you very much for making yourself available, and thank you very much for your evidence, which has been of assistance to us, and we're grateful to you. Because the situation's a little fluid, I think we should leave the summons in place. I don't think we'll need to speak to you again, but in case we do, I'll leave the summons in place, but you're certainly free to resume your normal schedule. Thank you very much, and we will adjourn to 10 a.m. tomorrow.
All rise.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Have a good one.